We're looking at the excerpt on sexuality from Sudhir Kakar and Katharina Kakar's book, The Indians, which is kind of like a psychological profile of the Indian people. We're of course interested in how the Indian psyche responds to the concept of sexuality. Now, obviously, when you say India and sexuality, the first word that pops into everybody's mind is the Kama Sutra. And there are, of course, a lot of assumptions about what the Kama Sutra is really about. And, everyone has this very reductive understanding of the Kama Sutra. They look at it as some kind of racy text about, erotic positions. And that's it. It's a very reductive understanding. And majority of people haven't read it. And probably if people read it, they would be bored by it because it is not that. First of all, the Kama Sutra is a manual on how to live well. The idea of the Kama Sutra is that if you figure out your sexual life, a lot of other things will sort of fall into place. That's kind of the point of what the Kama Sutra is really talking about. So, as Kakar mentions in the book, what the Kama Sutra really is about is the art of living. About finding a partner, maintaining power in marriage, committing adultery, living as or with a courtesan, using drugs, and also about positions in sexual intercourse, right? It is the world's first text to sort of record and frame together what sexuality really is about, right? And sort of places it in a very erudite space, which is important because in many ways what the Kama Sutra was trying to do can be called, and in fact Kakar calls it, a psychological war, because there is a certain perspective about sexuality, and there's a reductive perspective of sexuality even in Vatsyayana's time, right, where sexuality is just seen as having to fulfill reproductive requirements. And that's a very bland and dry way of looking at it. But it's also the Western way of looking at it. In fact, for the longest time, that was a way to looking at sexuality itself, that, divorce it from pleasure, only focus on reproduction and procreation, right? So Vatsyayana tried to rescue it from that and sort of place it into the idea that that is important, but pleasure is also important, and maybe we should understand how pleasure really works, right? So in many ways, what happens in the Kama Sutra, as well as in a lot of other Eastern texts or treatises on sexuality, like the Perfume Garden and even the Tao of Love and Sex, is that you're looking at a kind of what Michel Foucault, the French thinker and theorist, terms as the ars erotica. That is A-R-S, erotica. All right, as opposed to the Western take on it, which he calls Scientia Sexualis, S-C-I-E-N-T-I-A, Sexualis. And in fact, he defines it in his book. He says, ars erotica. In the erotic art, truth is drawn from pleasure itself, understood as a practice and accumulated as experience. Pleasure is not considered in relation to an absolute law of the permitted and the forbidden, nor by reference to a criterion of utility. So again, going back to the idea of that, it's not about fulfilling, needs of procreation alone, all right, but first and foremost in relation to itself. That means it's important in itself. Right, as opposed to Scientia Sexualis, which he has a pretty interesting description of. And he says that the Western civilization is the first and the only one to, focus on or practice Scientia Sexualis, which is, a procedure for telling the truth about sex, which is get to a kind of form of knowledge power, which is not about, in fact, it's against the idea of initiation and more to do with this idea of like, confess, tell me, what have you done, what do you believe in, what do you like, and kind of making sexuality come across as this, this terrible thing that you have and you should not have. You know, that you must be sort of bland and devoid of pleasure. Right? But of course, getting back to Kama Sutra itself, right? So for a lot of Western readers who first discovered the Kama Sutra, they were just like, this is amazing, because there is no, there's no focusing on the divine and, the idea that, oh, let's, invoke them and talk about fertility. There's none of that. It's about pleasure. Pure, unadulterated pleasure, but not in this very dark form necessarily. There is a certain sense that pleasure is important in itself and should be understood and cultivated, right? So there is a sense that the art of pleasure is a form of cultural awareness, and like it reflects culture, how cultured you are as a person, if you can understand and use it well. So very different from what Western theorists had up till then sort of noticed. And in fact, even in the context of India, the idea of Vatsyayana's Kama Sutra did challenge a lot of viewpoints that existed then, because Buddhism was popular, and one of the conjunctions of Buddhism was how the god of love, or erotica, sexuality, was associated or almost equated with Mara, which is death and destruction. This is very like anything to do with that is not good. A viewpoint that you can see reflected in a lot of Japanese fiction, for instance, like Mishima's Confessions of the Mask itself. You have this idea that let's not talk about it, let's not acknowledge it, let's push it away because it's bad. And if you repress it, it's a good thing. That's the right kind of society that we create. But I think we don't even have to get into psychoanalysis to understand what repressing a certain aspect of yourself does to you, right? And does to your personality, does to your understanding of life, right? So that's one of the things. Now, another thing that, in fact, you could call the Kama Sutra a very progressive book, not just because it's a manual on sexuality, but also because it proposes a certain kind of attitude towards the woman that was unheard of at that point of time. So one aspect of sexuality that they definitely discuss is that it should be within a certain kind of constraint. So much as people look at the Kama Sutra and assume that it's just people cavorting in sexual pleasure, actually the Kama Sutra is about cultivate it, don't go overboard, and don't hit on anything that moves, right? Because back then, women were seen as commodity. Actually, I don't think it's just back then, but okay. And the idea was that the concept of fidelity, of course, was demanded from the woman, not from the man. And even if you were married, you weren't sort of exempt from other people's advances. In fact, Kakar references Shvetaketu Ardalaki, who is one of the earliest people, and he's from the Upanishads, and he sort of presented a viewpoint that was considered revolutionary, which was maybe don't sleep with other men's wives, just kind of like focus on your own wife, like let's not do that. It's not right, because a woman was seen as cooked rice. If cooked rice is sitting there, you eat it. It has nothing to do with who it belongs to. So again, this idea of the woman is a commodity to be possessed, right? Problematic. So if the Kama Sutra was trying to, of course, rescue sexuality from this reductive procreation perspective of sexuality, it was also trying to rescue it from this kind of unchecked, rampant sexuality where there is no constraints, there is no social, frameworks in place, and everybody's just living with everybody, and with whether or not consent is involved. In fact, that's another thing that the Kama Sutra does talk about, the idea of consent, which was revolutionary for Vatsyayana's time. So that tells us a lot about what what life was really like back then, because consent wasn't even considered a concept till Vatsayana really spoke about it. So that's a very disturbing realization, right? And even the idea that violence and sexuality as a way of, as part of erotic play, which in modern contexts takes on a very disturbing term, rape play, for instance, within the confines of consent could work, but Achana also spoke about that maybe don't be too violent, don't get too aggressive, like aggression with consent makes some sense, but and in fact that is the underscoring aspect of it, that consent needs to exist, which again tells us a lot about what women probably went through back then. And in fact, the possession fantasy is something that you see heavily featured in erotic poetry of that age, right? Like a lot of early Sanskrit erotic poetry talks about the lover wanting to possess the beloved, and her trembling in desire, fear and desire. That was a popular fantasy that you saw, which again, if there is consent, is, I suppose, okay. All right. Now the idea is that one of the things that we have to understand, that having a certain restrictive view about sexuality may not be as bad an idea as having this kind of rampant, unchecked sexuality, which could be dangerous to people. So if anything, Kakar talks about the idea that the danger to erotic pleasure is less from the icy frost of morality and more from the fierce heat of instinctual desire. And that's true, because if there are no more social mores or norms to curtail how it's practiced, there is no guarantee what could happen, and there would be basically no accountability. But being rigid about it may not be necessarily as bad as this. All right. Now the thing is that one must understand that unlike, say, modern, or not necessarily modern alone, because courtly poetry of 14th century England, and a lot of European courtly poetry for that matter, falls within this tradition of romantic poetry where you pine for the lover. But classical erotic poetry from Sanskrit classical erotic poetry has more of a light-hearted banter to it compared to that kind of narrative. In fact, in the segment on love in the age of Kama Sutra, he talks about how it is not about completely identifying with your lover and becoming one with your lover. Of course, you don't abandon your lover, because the better you know your lover, the more pleasurable the experience becomes. So you don't abandon your lover, but you don't need to know their past, present, future, and you don't need to know everything about them, and you don't have to become one with them. That is not an idea that erotic poetry of that time really spoke about. But that's a feature of romantic poetry, which is why modern readers fed on that kind of romantic poetry would find the kind of dispassionate, I mean, you should definitely explore your partner better kind of an attitude as very, uncomfortable. But that's the difference of the erotic love versus romantic love that, he talks about. In fact, romantic love is about, there is a certain heaviness and certain kind of darkness to it, because you feel despair when you're separated from your lover, you feel heartbroken when you're separated from your lover, and you want to become one with your lover, you want to disappear into your lover. But in the erotic, it's about It's not about idealization, it's not about surrender, it's not about identification. Instead, your partner is a source of excitement and delight. So it's a very different kind of an energy. In fact, you can work with the idea of fetishizing the body to sort of heighten the experience of desire. But the inner world of your lover, doesn't matter. So that's a viewpoint that people will actually find uncomfortable. But what the Kama Sutra interestingly does is that while that kind of erotic love existed and the heaviness of the romantic love was also present but maybe not as popular, Kama Sutra tries to find like a balancing act, because Kama Sutra talks about a lot of other revolutionary ideas. For one of the most interesting things is that the Kama Sutra actually proposes love marriage as an ideal form of love, because the idea that you should get to know this one partner of yours well enough and devote yourself to them, which is revolutionary because out of the 8 forms of marriage within the Hindu marriage, Gandharva love is considered the least, because that's love marriage, that's choice between the partners. And even today it doesn't find much, it's frowned upon. Like it's not considered the ideal form. But Vachana says no, that's a good thing, because then you will devote yourself to one person, you won't be running around after other people. But he's like, I'm a realist, I understand that people are not perfect, so if you can't, then how do we fix this? Because remember, one of the things that the Kama Sutra does talk about is how to commit adultery, how to live with a courtesan, how to live as a courtesan. So there are things about, rejecting a partner, getting rid of a partner, especially for women, which is very revolutionary, because much of ancient text is very hard on the woman wanting a divorce, wanting to walk away from her partner. But Vachana, of course, does not place a woman on any pedestal. He's just realistic. He's like, she doesn't like the man, she doesn't have to stay with the man, and he gives like a detailed way of how to get rid of the man, which honestly will work in any circumstance, in any age, in any time, because it's about discrediting the person. But you can read up on that for yourself. But it's a very interesting perspective, because he envisions a woman as an equal partner. Of course, the intended audience for the entire book is male, alright, an elite male. But some of the chapters in the book are addressed to women. Like for instance, 2 of the book's 7 parts are addressed to women, the 4th to wife, 6th to the courtesan. So there are different parts addressed to women. And in fact, he believed that women ought to read it before they even touch puberty, which is, wow. In fact, that in many ways reflects the idea of the Argentinian filmmaker who made the movie Don't Look Down. His idea was that young adolescents should watch a movie like this so that they have a much more realistic and a more healthier perspective about sex and sexuality, as opposed to what is passed on nowadays, right? And that's a very broad-minded viewpoint, and continues to be revolutionary, even though Vachana proposed it so many centuries ago, and even now people talk about it. Still continues to stand as a very revolutionary idea, because people are not open to it. Now, he recommends or talks about the woman's enjoyment of the sexual act, and envisions her as an equal partner, obviously from a very male perspective, in the sense that if a woman enjoys it, she would be a good sexual partner, which means the experience of the man would be great. But even if it is coming from such a framework, the fact remains it is a far more broad-minded perspective of female sexuality than what we get to access in earlier ages, right? And he also, in fact, talks about how men should not force themselves on women, especially women who've had no sexual experience, because they might just ruin it for them henceforth. So there is a very clear and a very, I would say, what's the word for it? There's a very understanding way of presenting this idea of how sexuality ought to be approached for a young woman. And even if the aim is not necessarily to only think about the female experience, but by acknowledging her existence in it, he does something very different, right? Now, in medieval ages, of course, a lot of temple architecture does explore the erotic, and I think the most famous or infamous, however you want to look at it, is obviously the Khajuraho, which has a lot of erotic sculptures everywhere. And there are, of course, Indians have a great way of explaining it away and saying, oh, it's a metaphor for, God and the devotee. It could be, because the Mithuna motive of the beloved and God as being represented is definitely a feature. But we must also understand that unlike in the present age, where the temple is solely a religious place, in the past, temples were also spaces of cultural meeting, right? It was also, in fact, he says, centers of social, cultural, and political life. So it was like a more, a very integral part of their daily life. All right, but so a very, very different from how we probably understand it now, because now it's solely seen from the framework of religion alone. Now, the other thing is that in the medieval ages, another space that you see the erotic really come through and flourish is in bhakti poetry, because in bhakti poetry, fusing with the beloved, who is God, is the greatest thing you can achieve. Right? So there is a kind of open acceptance of the erotic. Of course, the one that all your energy is devoted to is God, and you, the beloved, want to sort of fuse with God. That's the idea of pretty much all the bhakti poetry. So bhakti's essential energy is actually erotic, and that is brilliant. And he gives a lot of really interesting expressions of that. So you can see how there is no distinction between the religious and the erotic when it comes to, say, bhakti literature. So in the medieval age, there is, of course, a blending of the two, which, of course, wasn't there in our early understanding of, like, in the ancient period where the erotic was purely erotic and that's it. But here there is a certain blending of it, which is brilliant and quite fascinating. So with this, we sort of wrap up with our understanding of ancient and medieval sexuality as presented in Kakar's Indians.